Just a quick introduction to the Circular Economy Taskforce. The Circular Economy Taskforce is an initiative of Green Alliance, which, as I said earlier, is a UK, London-based NGO and charity environmental think tank. We have a resources theme, which has evolved out of many years of work on waste policy. And the task force comprises the companies that you see along the bottom, and RAP, whom Colin mentioned, are also a partner. And this is a mode of working that Green Alliance has involved to have funding at a fairly modest level from businesses, so that we spread that funding. We're not dependent on any one business or indeed source for our funding, but we also get business reality brought to us. And in the case of the Circular Economy Taskforce, this is not just a question of these companies talking about the great things they've done or are trying to do. It's very much them also sharing their experience of what the barriers to developing more circular systems might be. And in the first year of the task force, we were also supported by DEFRA. And part of the reason we were supported by DEFRA was exactly those kind of resource risk concerns that Colin started by outlining, which is we have moved from agenda which is worrying about what do we do with our waste. The idea of landfills filling up, which was never quite the case anyway, but the worries about landfill incineration on the end of the pipe, now we're starting to worry as much, if not more, about the upstream effects, where we're going to get all these resources from in future, and the effects of bringing those into our economy if we don't get things to have second, third, fourth, if we can, indefinite life. And that's the essence of circularity. As Colin started off by showing, it's about not losing stuff from the economy, not just because we know that has enormous environmental benefits to try and prevent some of that upstream extraction, but because it keeps value in the economy as well. And that's the conversation the task force has. And the first year report, that's the cover of it. You can find it on the Green Alliance website. And it's a set of insights into what stops companies adopting more circular behaviours and what they and governments potentially need to do. So that's a quick introduction to the report. That's just a recap of the members. That's the same diagram that Colin showed. This was the starting point for us. RAP came to a seminar we had, I think, in 2009 with our then consortium of businesses, and I think the businesses we had involved, like Boots and Sainsbury at the time, even sort of kind of recoined that phrase and said, our economy is not very circular, is it? Exactly as Colin says, there's a thin green line that is our recovery. We know that could be much better, and what we're talking about here is how we get it to be much better. But as we've also said, I'm sorry about the typefaces, they haven't for some reason at the top translated onto this projector. But what that says is price volatility in metals, plastic and food is actually greater than the underlying volatility in global economies, which we all know has been quite high over recent years for a multitude of reasons. But what we've evolved is a set of analysis and arguments that at least part of this is environmental. At least part of this price volatility tracks back to environmental pressures on extraction of resources. And copper is one very interesting example. You may hear rhetoric of people saying we're running out of resources. We will never run out of any resource. It will just get harder to get hold of. And what that graph is telling you is that for copper, we've had the easy stuff. There's plenty of it in the Earth's crust if we have the means to get it, but getting at it will take ever more energy and water. And those pressures, for instance, in Chile, have meant over the last decade that opening a new copper mine costs twice as much as it did 10 years ago. And that's because they're running out of water in the parts of Chile where they mine copper. They're now having to desalinate water and pump it up mountainsides, and all kinds of things that seem very extreme. But our hunger for a resource like copper is so great that that's what happens. Now that all tracks back to the idea that if we throw copper into landfills, we are automatically losing all that environmental impact and all that value that has gone into bringing us that resource. Why would we not be trying much harder to capture it? So we've developed a narrative with the companies in the task force that this is environmental risk, it's also price volatility risk, it's material security. And this now becomes as much as part of the argument for being circular with our resources, for getting them back, as avoiding downstream waste problems. And just to reiterate that point, and as Colin said, we know that reuse and remanufacturing has greater environmental benefits than recycling. So if we interpret recycling as breaking something into its component materials and putting it through some kind of processing, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, in the case of a mobile phone, that is basically mincing it into tiny pieces, into a pile of flake that has some fragments of very valuable metals, which in the case of this country is then sent off to a large smelter in Belgium, because we don't have one here, to recover all those valuable metals. And yes, you can do that. And yes, it is now, because of the WEEE regulations that mandate the collection and bring it to the people who do that, it's economic. But it still, as that diagram illustrates, only saves some of the CO2. If we reuse the phone, you wouldn't be going through all that processing. You'd be getting a bigger benefit in terms of saved carbon dioxide. But you'd also, particularly, be getting potentially much more value. And this is one half of a diagram that's in the final report that shows something we all know, which is the raw material cost of a product is a tiny fraction of what we pay for it. All the added value is in the innovation, the inventiveness, and the value we put on it. But exactly the same is true at the back end. If you can find a market for reusing things like cars, phones, and indeed t-shirts, they have a value, and they have much more value than you break them down into the constituent parts. The problem is, at the moment, there are many more markets for the constituent materials, even at a low price, than there are stable and coherent markets for the reuse option. We've done it pretty well with cars. Everyone's used to the idea of a second-hand car market. That's pretty good. We have some reuse markets for things like phones, but a lot of those are abroad. They're being exported abroad. There are some models, and we have reasonable markets in some ways for clothing. But on all of those, we could do much better. And simply because they have a reuse market value at the moment doesn't mean the infrastructure exists to actually get them reused. And this is one of the things the task force companies are very, very keen to get through to people. They may have desire for reuse of products, remanufacturing, and even recycling. But if they don't want to do it themselves, if those companies don't want to divert from core business, the ones who are on the manufacturing end, and suddenly become resource management companies, and the resource management companies at the other end, the Viridors and Veolas, are not going to suddenly become manufacturers. If those things remain separate, someone has to bring them together. And if there's no economic market driver, if there's no stable contract price or certainty of supply and demand to make those things come together, they won't happen. And somebody has to, therefore, take control and make them happen. So where there are things like producer responsibility, they're made to happen. Where there's a strong price for valuable metals, they happen. But otherwise, a lot of the time, particularly for the reuse side, there is not a third party who will facilitate that and make it happen. And the effort and the initiatives we have seen have often been driven by public authorities, by charities. I'm sure a lot of people represented here from the community side, which is fantastic. But at the end of the day, what we need is a completely stable and functioning set of markets to make things like reuse and remanufacturing a reality. And so the narrative we've developed at Green Alliance around this is, yes, there are things businesses can do. That's, a lot of what Colin was saying. Brands can take control. As we were saying earlier, just because Boots doesn't want to become a resource reclamation company, it doesn't mean it couldn't go into partnership with a facilities management company, for instance, and make sure it gets store fittings back in the same way that Sainsbury's has, for instance. Marks and Spencer's have formed a partnership with Oxfam to get clothes back extremely successfully. They're now facilitating the reuse of millions of garments that people might otherwise have not even thought about taking to a charity shop for reuse, and they've raised a lot of money for Oxfam and saved a lot of clothes from going to landfill in the process. So it can be done. Our brands can take control, they can form partnerships and joint ventures, they can get these things done. But we also know, as Colin said, that design is a big part of it. If you're here for this afternoon, you'll hear Sophie Thomas from the RSA talking about the design element. I'm a guilty party on the Apple front. This is the laptop that can't be easily recycled because it's glued, which I didn't look into when I was choosing it for its energy efficiency. All these things need to be brought to the fore. And actually there is a role, as Colin said, for standards, for the private sector to bring this forward, but there may also be a role simply for regulation. There's an eco-design directive that exists at EU level, which could be the place where it is mandated that products that go on the market must be easy to disassemble, they must be modular, they must be repairable at a reasonable cost. And of course that would bring the price of those options down for everybody because it would become the market norm. So yes, a role for driving things down supply chains for brands, but probably a set of framing conditions needed for government, and the businesses that we're in conversation with are very clear about that. That if the markets don't start, if not enough people take the initiative, if the markets don't start to function on their own, RAP of course does fantastic work on markets, but can't condition everything, then there is a role for government. Because at the end of the day, the money that goes into the kit, we can't forget that we're talking about a physical universe, and that everything we do is in fact an extreme version of the sort of entropy in which stuff is scattered everywhere. We take our stuff, we use it, and we just scatter it. Somebody has to get it back, some way that has to be brought back into use. That's an expensive and complicated business. And if people are going to pay for the infrastructure to do that, they've got to be certain that the markets will function properly. And part of what might drive that is a government framework, as well as action by progressive business. So that's the kind of arguments we've been developing. We will be carrying on our work beyond. We're in the second year of the task force with outputs this year. We're starting to look at novel materials for circularity as well, and a range of other things. We're expanding the task force next year, so we will have room to take on board new businesses for those who might be interested. But for the moment, I hope led to some interesting debates and put some interesting thoughts out there. So I will leave it there for the moment. I can take some quick questions. Perhaps if we just have a little bit of Q&A and then we'll go straight on to Cressy. Okay, it's very odd speaking and chairing, I have to say. Sir.
It's been on the Borough. I heard a presentation in November by the person who set up Fix It, which is a repair manual thing on the internet. And he says one of the biggest problems with getting things repaired is that most of the manufacturers will not publish repair manuals. So even if it wasn't stuck together, you probably couldn't get a repair manual telling you need to do X, Y, Z to get the battery out. And so perhaps your working group, perhaps put into with some of his stuff, the EU is trying to make it compulsory that they publish repair manuals, because that would then help the repair side grow.
Yeah. So
you can't repair something. You do, you know, you can't. You're bringing to example on cars. You know, you can always get
the manual
for a car. You know how to take things out. You might not have the courage to do it these days because there's so much electronics on it. But you can at least repair it when to a toaster. Unless it's very obvious, even if you have a spare part, you can do it. And then your other slide, it showed the repair bits. It'd be a lot easier for people to dismantle things and sell the parts through eBay or something if there's repair manuals for other people to do it. So I think repair manuals are quite crucial.
So the question is the lack of it being unable to get hold of data about how things are made. Is an obstacle. Completely agree. I think there are several organisations, and again I think Sophie Thomas might talk about them, that are campaigning very hard to get access to manufacturers' information. So sometimes it's called a bill of materials, just to know what's in a product. Sometimes it's about having, as you say, the repair instructions. But a very strong theme through all this circular economy work is transparency, information, pre-competitive behaviours, trying to get companies to collaborate, as Colin was saying, on standard devices where they get no competitive advantage from having a different kind of charger, probably. So all those themes are very strong in this debate, and they need other voices to come in around them and call for that. I mean, if as procurers, those of you in the room who buy products of any kind that could be repaired, you need to contact the manufacturers and say, why can't I have a repair manual? Because that's the only way they take any notice. Thank you. Should we have a lady there?
I'm Sarah Hepworth, I come from Smart Development. We're a training and development company specialising in the waste industry. We've talked a lot about manufacturers and what they can do to change. I think one of the fundamental problems is the consumers. We work with recycling companies, and a lot of their business comes in from major electronic suppliers with cosmetic issues. until people are willing to buy something that looks slightly dinged up, because we're selling them on to abroad. How are we going to change the consumer views on the cosmetics before we can get people to repair them? Surely the cosmetics side of things has got to change also.
Okay, so for the question is, if consumers aren't prepared to accept flawed goods, how are we going to get a better sense of reuse? Again, absolutely agree with you. I think what's interesting is we've had this debate for food. I think one of the real signs of hope we have is actually people do seem to be taking on board messages about food waste, their own waste and store waste. And so this idea of imperfect fruit and vegetables is now, a lot of the retailers gone down the road of actually just selling them as sort of a more budget product without calling them imperfect. Now I don't know whether that's a route for that kind of thing. It's like the electronics equivalent of basics or something, or whether, as you say, it's simply saying to people, look, you're rejecting something with a scratch is going to cost a certain amount of carbon and energy somewhere. Now those, I think our experience is that those numbers about environmental impacts work on business minds quite a lot, but whether they work on consumer minds, I think is a very open question. It may be simply a question of giving a price differential on those things and I'm not assuming that. I think there's also a manufacturer psychology that says I want to put something in someone's home that's pristine, just like the retailers wanted us to have the straight carrots. We never knew we wanted a straight carrot, really, because if the unstraight ones are half the price, we'll be really happy to have them.